A lot of men wait until the disrespect is loud, when she's yelling, insulting, shutting down conversations with contempt, or making you feel like a stranger in your own relationship. But disrespect doesn't always announce itself with fireworks. In fact, it's often quiet. It starts with tone, with avoidance, with the little jabs passed off, just jokes. It starts with the rolled eyes when you speak, the constant interruptions when you're trying to explain something, or the harmless comparisons to other men, usually cloaked in sarcasm. And here's the trap: if you're not paying attention, you'll normalize it. You'll excuse it. You'll internalize it. And once that happens, she won't even need to raise her voice to diminish you. The erosion will already be underway. This is why awareness is your first line of defense. A man must learn to feel when something is off before he can name it. Most men are taught to either suppress emotion or explode under pressure. Very few are taught to observe the small shifts in energy. The tightening of the gut, the disconnection in the conversation, the sense that your presence is no longer being honored. That's the real skill, emotional perception without paranoia. It's the ability to sit across from your woman, notice her dismissiveness, and calmly ask yourself, is this a one-off? Or is this the beginning of a pattern? Because disrespect doesn't often show up as a single moment. It shows up as a repeated rhythm. And that rhythm becomes the culture of your relationship. If the culture is one where your voice is frequently ignored, your needs are routinely minimized, or your value is taken for granted, that's not miscommunication, that's tolerated disrespect. And once you've taught someone that you're willing to tolerate it, changing that dynamic becomes much harder, not impossible, but harder. You'll need not just words, but consistency, boundaries, and often a willingness to let go of the relationship entirely if change doesn't follow. Now, let's go a little deeper. Why do so many men ignore these signs? It's not just denial. Sometimes it's fear. The fear of rocking the boat. The fear of being alone. The fear that calling it out will lead to confrontation they feel unequipped to handle. And in some cases, it's conditioning. Men are often taught that enduring disrespect is part of being the bigger person. But there's a stark difference between patience and passivity. Patience allows space for understanding and growth. Passivity invites erosion. One builds bridges, the other lets termites eat the foundation. Psychologically, when you allow consistent low-grade disrespect, you teach your nervous system to feel unsafe in your own home. You begin to question your instincts, doubt your perception, and in time, you may even suppress your voice to keep the peace. But peace without respect isn't peace, it's quiet suffering. This is why recognition is so critical. Because before you can fix a dynamic, you have to be honest about it. Not just with her, but with yourself. And here's the truth: once you recognize disrespect, you're faced with a choice. And that choice will define everything that comes after. You can speak or you can stay silent. You can raise your standards, or you can lower your self-worth. So if you're in a relationship right now and you're sensing that shift, don't dismiss it. Don't explain it away. Observe. Reflect. Then respond, not out of emotion, but out of self-respect. Because respect isn't just something you get from others. It's something you reinforce with every decision you make. And the first decision, the most important one, is to never let subtle disrespect become your new normal. You don't have to demand respect. You just have to stop tolerating its absence. Once you've recognized the subtle signs of disrespect, the next step isn't confrontation. It's definition. You can't expect a woman to respect boundaries you've never clearly set. Most men, when it comes to boundaries, operate from two extremes: silence or explosion. Either they say nothing for too long, hoping things will improve on their own, or they bottle up every frustration till it bursts out in an emotional outpouring that sounds more like a threat than a boundary, but neither strategy works. Boundaries, when properly understood, are not tools for control. They're expressions of self-respect. They tell the other person where you end and where they must not cross. Here's the problem: we live in a culture that often romanticizes emotional sacrifice, especially for men. You're told to be patient, understanding the rock, the calm in the storm. And while those traits are valuable, they become dangerous when they're used to justify allowing disrespect to go unchecked. Being patient doesn't mean being passive. Setting boundaries doesn't make you harsh. It makes you clear. And clarity is kindness. When you define what is acceptable, you give the relationship a structure it can grow within. Without that, everything becomes vague, reactive, and eventually resentful. Now, philosophically, boundaries are not about the other person. They're about you. They aren't rules you impose to manipulate behavior. They're standards you live by that communicate your values. For example, if your boundary is that you won't accept being insulted or belittled, that boundary exists whether she crosses it or not. The purpose isn't to control her. It's to guide you. If she crosses it, your job is not to scream or beg, it's to act calmly, consistently. That's what gives your words weight. This is where many men lose their footing. They confuse boundary setting with trying to fix her behavior. But your boundary doesn't say, you must change. It says, this is what I will or will not participate in. That subtle shift moves you out of a reactive frame and back into leadership. And make no mistake, emotional leadership is not about dominance. It's about direction. A woman will not follow a man who constantly shifts his standards depending on his mood or her reaction. What she responds to, consciously or unconsciously, is consistency. The boundary has to remain, even if it causes temporary discomfort. That's how it earns respect. But let's be real, holding a boundary is uncomfortable. It might mean saying, if this continues, I will need space. And following through. It might mean walking away from a toxic conversation instead of arguing endlessly to be heard. It might mean refusing to apologize for something you didn't do just to keep the peace. And yes, it might even mean ending the relationship if your boundaries are continually violated. That's not cruelty, that's integrity. A boundary without consequence is just a suggestion. And suggestions do not shape dynamics. Convictions do. So ask yourself, do you know what your boundaries actually are? Can you communicate them without aggression, guilt, or shame? Traits women. Can you hold them even when it's inconvenient, even when it triggers resistance? Because if you can't, then your relationship isn't being built on mutual respect. It's being built on silence and fear. And anything built on fear will eventually fall apart. You don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need to argue to be respected. You just need to be clear and consistent. The moment you decide that your peace is non-negotiable, your presence starts commanding a different kind of energy. That's when you stop chasing respect and start attracting it. Once you've established boundaries, what often follows is a test. Not always conscious, but instinctual, a pushback, a reaction. This is where most men falter, not because they're weak, because they mistake emotional reactivity for emotional strength. When a woman disrespects you, especially after you've set a boundary, your first impulse might be to snap, withdraw, or become passive-aggressive. You think you're asserting yourself, but really, you're being led by ego, not principle. And the truth is, ego is loud, reactive, and fragile. Discipline, on the other hand, is quiet, firm, and grounded. This is where masculine emotional discipline comes into play. And it's one of the most misunderstood forms of power. Most people hear emotional discipline and think suppression. That's not it. Suppression is denial. Discipline is regulation. It's the ability to experience an emotional charge without letting it hijack your voice, your actions, or your integrity. It's the capacity to stay rooted in your values even when you're emotionally triggered. That's what sets leaders apart from reactors. And in a relationship, your ability to regulate your emotional state becomes the foundation for how your woman responds to you. Because here's the psychological truthing women test not to destroy you, but to locate your center. She's not always doing it consciously, but there is a part of her, often instinctive, that is asking, can I trust him to remain steady when things get tense? If your answer to that question is emotional volatility, she'll lose faith in your leadership, not because she wants perfection, but because inconsistency breeds insecurity. And emotional insecurity in a man doesn't create safety. It creates confusion. This doesn't mean you can't feel hurt. You can. You should. You're human. But what matters is, A, how you handle that hurt. Can you say, I didn't like how you spoke to me earlier, in a tone that's calm but clear? Can you walk away from an argument not to avoid her, but to protect the energy of the relationship from unnecessary escalation? Can you refuse to match her chaos with your own? Not because you're scared, but because you know your power doesn't live in noise. That's emotional discipline. And it is deeply masculine. Philosophically, this is about self-governance. You cannot lead a relationship if you cannot lead yourself. You cannot demand respect externally if you don't embody it internally. Emotional discipline is not just about relationships. It's a life skill. It's the difference between reacting and responding, between impulse and intention. And when you master that in the relational space, something powerful happens, the dynamic shifts. Your woman stops trying to provoke your reaction and starts leaning into your presence. She may resist at first, especially if she's used to pulling emotional strings, but if you remain centered, she'll either rise to meet you or reveal that she never intended to respect you in the first place. Either way, you gain clarity. The work, then, is not to silence your emotions, but to mature them, to allow yourself to feel fully without losing command of your direction, to take a breath when you want to bite back, to pause when you want to explode, and to speak only when your words will elevate the moment, not degrade it. Because the mark of a powerful man is not how loud he gets when disrespected, it's how calm he remains when provoked. The man who controls his emotions controls the frame. And when you control the frame, you no longer need to fight for respect. You simply live in a way that demands it without a single raised voice. That's not weakness. That's the highest form of strength. One of the most uncomfortable, but essential questions a man must ask himself when dealing with disrespect. Is this truly her pattern? Or have I played a role in shaping it? It's easy to point fingers. It's easy to label her disrespectful and walk away with your pride intact. But real growth demands self-inquiry. Because relationships don't just reveal who your partner is, they also reflect who you've been. A dynamic doesn't emerge in a vacuum. Sometimes what we interpret as her disrespect is a reaction to our inconsistency. Maybe you weren't clear about what mattered to you. Maybe you avoided conflict, thinking silence was the higher road. Maybe you abandoned your purpose, lost direction, or became emotionally unavailable, and she started to fill that vacuum with criticism or control. That doesn't excuse poor behavior, but it does explain where some of it may have found room to grow. This isn't about blame. It's about ownership. You can't fix what you won't face. And unless you're willing to face your own complicity in the dynamic, you'll repeat the same pattern in your next relationship, just with a different woman and a different setting. The pattern isn't always a her. Sometimes it's you. It's the way you silence your truth. It's the way you ignore your needs. It's the way you rationalized flags because you fear conflict or worse, abandonment. And yet there are times when the pattern A is hers. Some women carry unresolved trauma, dysfunctional beliefs about men, or deep-seated control issues that manifest as chronic disrespect. You could be the most present, principled, emotionally disciplined man and still be met with constant challenge, dismissal, or emotional warfare. In that case, your task is different. It's not to overcorrect yourself. It's to recognize that no amount of good behavior can fix someone who isn't ready to do their own internal work. The real wisdom lies in discernment. You have to learn to tell the difference in a situation that calls for self-correction and one that calls for self-preservation. If the disrespect arose because you failed to assert your voice or abandoned your own center, then your healing lies in reclaiming your power. But if the disrespect continues despite clarity, consistency, and calm leadership, then you're no longer dealing with a dynamic. You're dealing with a decision. And the decision is this: will you stay in a space that diminishes you, or will you choose your peace over her potential? This is where many men get stuck, between guilt and hope. Guilt for having contributed to the dysfunction, and hope that things might return to the early days when everything felt light and respectful. But nostalgia is not strategy, and guilt is not atonement. The only way forward is truth. You must look at the current state of the relationship and ask L, what is being reflected back to me? Not the fantasy, not the potential, but the actual dynamic day after day. If the reflection shows a cycle where you are routinely diminished, questioned, or disrespected, even after doing the internal work, then your next step is not more effort, it's acceptance. And from that acceptance, a new kind of power emerges. The power to walk away in anger, but in alignment. The power to say, I have learned all I needed to learn from this chapter. I'm not here to be tolerated. I'm here to be respected. Because ultimately your healing doesn't lie in fixing her. It lies in finding yourself. And when you do, you won't need to fight for respect. You'll simply stop entertaining anything that makes you forget your worth. One of the most misunderstood acts of addressing disrespect is the role of consequences. And let me be clear, this isn't about punishment. This isn't about manipulation, revenge, or trying to hurt someone into behaving better. That's immature and frankly beneath you. This is about alignment, about what happens when a boundary is crossed and how you respond not emotionally. Because if you say, I won't tolerate this, but continue to stay, continue to engage, continue to allow, what you've said doesn't matter. She doesn't believe your words. She believes your actions. Here's the psychological truthing. People don't respond to what you say, they respond to what you reinforce. And reinforcement doesn't just happen with praise. It happens with tolerance. Every time you allow a line to be crossed without consequence, you're silently teaching her that line was imaginary, that it was more of a suggestion than a principle. And over time, she stops taking your standards seriously, not necessarily out of malice, but because you've shown her that even you don't stand by them. Consequences, then, are not weapons. They are boundaries in motion. They're the embodiment of your standards when words are no longer enough. And the key is to deliver them without drama. You don't need to scream, threaten, or make grand declarations. That's ego trying to overcompensate. Real consequence is quiet. It's measured. It's consistent. You simply stop engaging in disrespectful conversations. You pull back your energy. You remove privileges, access to your time, your attention, your emotional availability. In extreme cases, you walk away entirely, not as a tactic, but as a reflection of your values. Let's make this real. If she mocks you in front of others, you don't launch into a shouting match. You don't get into reactive mode. You calmly let her know it was unacceptable. And if it happens again, you won't be sticking around to be humiliated. And if it does happen again, you don't beg, you don't plead. You simply leave the situation. If it becomes a pattern, you leave the relationship, not to punish her, but to protect your self-respect. Because when your boundaries are firm, the message is simple E. I don't fight for my dignity. I withdraw from what disrespects it. Philosophically, this is the essence of masculine leadership. Not controlling someone's behavior, but controlling your own environment. Choosing where your energy goes and what kind of energy you allow to stay in your space. When you stop reacting and start responding with consequence, the dynamic shifts. You no longer feel powerless. You no longer feel trapped in cycles of disrespect. Because now you understand something critical. Staying in a disrespectful dynamic is not about loyalty. It's about fear. And once you overcome the fear of losing someone, you gain the freedom to choose yourself. Consequences teach people how to treat you. But more importantly, they remind you of your own power. They bring you back to your center. They ground you in the truth that you don't need to force respect. You just need to stop entertaining its opposite. And when you operate from that place, you stop trying to convince anyone of your worth. You simply embody it. So the next time you're faced with disrespect, ask yourself, what is the consequence of this, not emotionally, strategically? And then follow through, not with noise, but with clarity. Because a man who holds his standard without wavering doesn't just demand respect. He commands it. Respect doesn't from the volume of your voice. It comes from the weight of your absence when your boundaries are no longer honored. All of this, recognizing respect, setting boundaries, staying emotionally disciplined, taking ownership, and following through with consequence, ultimately points to one deeper truthing: the relationship follows the frame you set, the emotional tone, the level of respect, the direction of growth. It all starts with your frame. Not through control, not through domination, but through leadership. And leadership, at its core, is not about authority over her. It's about authority over you yourself. It's about embodying clarity, purpose, and calm direction, even when the relationship feels uncertain. A lot of men hand over the frame without even realizing it. They make their woman the emotional compass of the relationship. If she's upset, they're scrambling to fix it. If she's disrespectful, they overexplain or overcompensate. If she pulls away, they chase. And slowly, without even meaning to, they start reacting to her energy instead of anchoring in their own. This is how the frame slips. And when you lose the frame, you lose the balance. Because now, instead of leading with intention, you're surviving by reaction. Reclaiming the frame doesn't mean silencing your partner. It doesn't mean ignoring her needs or dictating every outcome. That's insecurity pretending to be leadership. Real frame is internal. It's when you know who you are, what you stand for, what you will and will not accept. And you move through the relationship with that clarity, regardless of how emotional things become. And when a woman feels that from you, when she senses that she can't shake your center, her respect for you deepens. Not because you force it, but because she trusts it. There's a psychological principle at work here in any dynamic. The one with the most emotional regulation sets the tone. And this doesn't just apply in conflict. It applies in daily decisions, in long-term planning, in emotional intimacy. The man who has vision, discipline, and emotional steadiness isn't constantly fighting for dominance. He doesn't need to. His life speaks for itself. His direction sets the current. And the woman in that relationship either aligns with that current or she self-selects out of it. But that only works if your direction is real. If you're not building something in your life, if you're not grounded in your own growth, your own principles, your own purpose, then the relationship becomes your identity. And when that happens, you lose leverage. You become dependent on her emotional state to define yours. And the moment she senses that the dynamic starts to deteriorate, not because she wants to hurt you, but because no one feels safe when the frame is fragile. So you have to lead, not with pressure, but with presence. Not by force, but by firmness. You walk in your values, you speak with intention, you refuse to play emotional tug of war. And when conflict arises, you don't retreat or explode. You hold the frame. The traits women, you decide what behavior you will allow and what you won't. You remain the emotional anchor, not the emotional sponge. And here's the deeper philosophy. When you lead your life with structure, your relationships take shape around that structure. It's not about being rigid. It's about being rooted. And when you're rooted, the winds of emotional chaos don't uproot you. They pass over. You become the calm in the storm, not because you suppress emotion, but because you omit. So if you want to end the cycle of disrespect, stop focusing on changing her, fixing her, convincing her, reclaim the frame, define your values, live them, and let everything and everyone adjust accordingly. Because the strongest position you can hold in any relationship isn't control, it's clarity. And clarity, for tradeswomen without apology, becomes the most unshakable form of power a man can possess.